I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about my sense of the lessons arising from Winterbourne View Hospital, because very often when a report is finished, it's an artificial end point. This week is quite significant in terms of the history of Winterbourne View Hospital, because the 11 former members of staff are being sentenced this week, and next week Panorama intend to sustain the momentum around change by having a follow-up to Winterbourne View Hospital, reminding us of some of the abuses that we've seen this morning. So I'm going to chunk this into sort of two broad sets of lessons. I believe there are many more, because it's a doorstopper of a report, and I haven't helpfully put in a section called the lessons, because I believe that for different sectors, the lessons are somewhat different. We've had a reminder of some of the abuses that took place at Winterbourne View Hospital, and I think the first and most uncomfortable lesson is that if it hadn't been for an undercover reporter securing employment for only 5 weeks during early 2011, it's really unlikely that the fact and extent of assaults that people endured in the hospital would have come to light. That's not a cue, by the way, to have an undercover reporter in every home. It's not feasible. So we very much have to think about how on earth do we discover what is happening in our services, in our provider services. It has resulted in essential soul searching, not least of Castlebeck, the owners of the hospital, but certainly the ex-patients and their relatives, and the individual professionals and their agencies. It's not that surprising that some patients, even in the last month, have disclosed further events in the hospital that were not known, unfortunately, to either the police or to the Serious Case Review. It's been incredibly distressing, not merely for the families of patients in the hospital, but also for the families of other people, of people with learning disabilities and autism. And I'm reminded, I stayed last night with a dear friend and mother of my godson who has very complicated support needs. And her question was, is this part of the waiting future? Because if it is, I don't want it. And that should exercise all of us as we commission services and as we visit them as professionals and also as friends and relatives. One of the pressing questions that exercised the panel that I worked with, the safeguarding panel, was how could a hospital for adults with learning disabilities and autism, many of whom were detained under sections of the Mental Health Act, so successfully deceive professionals and some of the families that it had the expertise to assess and treat people in a safe and supportive environment. And who would have imagined that a hospital could be so very dangerous to the people it was intended to serve? And a further lesson has been the enormous disappointment as well as distress of families that the exposure of this hospital by Panorama has emptied of meaning and credibility any notions we may have had about hospitals being places of healing. And I will say a little bit more about people's physical health problems, but I found it profoundly shocking that people's physical health care receives so little attention at the hospital. It's made families, and I believe also commissioners and providers, seriously question the clinical leadership of doctors and nurses and other professionals in promoting both the health and well-being of adults with learning disabilities and autism. It seems to me that Panorama gave us some very compelling images, we've had a glimpse of them this morning, that would accompany any definition of institutional abuse. And in addition to the unbelievable slapping and hurt arising from that, just to remind you, we also watched staff wrestle patients to the floor to be physically restrained And we learned that these restraints were both planned and provoked. It was very painful for people to be restrained, and indeed some people did require accident and emergency treatment after being restrained. We saw nurses ignore the behaviour of support workers as they used water-based punishment, and patients such as Simon and Simone being slapped incredibly hard. We watched Simone having her eyes poked, her fingers and wrists bent back, and her arm twisted behind her back. And we saw her being restrained under chairs, having her hair pulled and her head covered. And we saw her being held down to have a paracetamol tablet. So an incredibly coercive culture prevailed at Winterbourne View Hospital. And that culture was evident even in its first 12 months of operation. There were occasions when commissioners were informed of patients being hurt following a restraint. There were some very full accounts. There were concerns too about the adequacy of the skills of support workers and the staff within the hospital, and there were concerns about the complement of staff within the hospital. The other lesson is that, as I've already intimated, is that it's really unlikely that this review has identified all the crimes and abusive acts that took place at Winterbourne View Hospital. Some people are only just now in safer places able to describe what happened to them all those months ago. And this is very typical, of course, with institutional abuse. The full scale of crimes is unknown. And Panorama made the connection between the abuses within the former long-stay hospitals for adults with learning disabilities and Winterbourne View Hospital. But what the review has confirmed is that unlike the decommissioned long-stay hospitals, Castlebeck Limited wasn't starved of funds. And in 2010, Winterbourne View Hospital had a turnover of £3.7 million. But we don't know how much of this was spent on patient treatment. I've been interested in discussions with commissioners, NHS commissioners, that £3,500 on average a week is almost loose change. And in contrast to a local authority, that is such a lot of money. But it's loose change to the NHS. And commissioners truly did not know what it was that they were purchasing. Not all of them checked the CQC reports about the service. Some of them said, well, it's got a good reputation, we've always sent people there, it's moving people closer to home. Nobody checked. And yet Castlebeck said that from a financial perspective, Winterbourne View Hospital was one of the best performers in the group. Yet they did not nurture it. And leaving aside the human cost of placing adults with learning disabilities and autism in hospitals very distant from their families, their networks and places where they're known, Castlebeck benefited financially to a substantial degree, and the hospital's existence was entirely dependent on public contracts. And yet nobody was asking them, what are we getting for this? What are you doing? What will you reliably deliver on behalf of this person? Nobody was asking searching questions at all, whether they were getting value for money or whether they were using the resources efficiently. And for me, a very crucial lesson is that business opportunism doesn't have to comply with government policy. I found it really helpful that in the introduction to the Department of Health's interim report, Paul Burstow said in his foreword, with the closure of long-stay hospitals and the campus closure programme, a new form of institutional care developed, what we now know as assessment and treatment units, not part of current policy and certainly not recommended practice. That's really helpful and emphatic. And yet commissioners were able to sidestep this fact, and the hospital was built unknown to the local authority on what is a business park. And the creation of this hospital confirms that it's possible to build units and hospitals for